the FBI didn't stop the payment to save money. According to sources familiar with the investigation, they stopped it because something had already gone quiet 48 hours before the first ransom note ever arrived. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker, the small implanted device that had been transmitting real-time RF signals to a remote monitoring station, had stopped emitting. The signal was gone. And if that information is accurate, and investigators reportedly treated it as significant, then from the moment Savannah Guthrie's phone rang with the news that her mother was missing, the FBI's negotiation team was already operating under a theory that nobody on the outside understood yet. They weren't trying to get Nancy back. According to this line of investigation, they were trying to identify who took her, and whether paying $6 million in Bitcoin would do anything except fund whoever was responsible for making that signal disappear. That is the starting point for what we're about to cover, not a theory dressed up as fact. A documented investigative pattern built from court filings in Pima County, public statements from the FBI, blockchain data from the wallets named in the ransom notes, and the behavioral profile of an operation that sent ransom demands to TMZ and a local Tucson news station instead of directly to the family. Every one of those decisions, who the notes went to, what they said, what they didn't say, and what the FBI decided to do in response, tells us something specific about how the Bureau assessed this situation from the first hour. And when you lay all of it out together, the picture it forms is not the picture that most coverage of this case has presented. Nancy Guthrie was 73 years old. She had spent her life building something, a family, a faith, a quiet dignity that her daughter Savannah has spoken about publicly with genuine reverence. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most recognized journalists in the country, the anchor of NBC's Today Show, a person whose professional life is defined by asking hard questions and finding accurate answers. And when her mother vanished from Tucson, Arizona in late January 2026, the collision of those two realities, the high-profile daughter and the missing mother, created exactly the kind of media environment that the person or people behind this case appear to have anticipated and deliberately exploited. Nancy disappeared from her home in the Tucson area. There was evidence of a disturbance at the scene. Pima County Sheriff's deputies responded. And then, within days, the nature of the investigation changed dramatically because the ransom notes started arriving. Not to the family, to the press. If you've been following the Nancy Guthrie case and you want every development the moment it surfaces, and what we're covering today goes significantly deeper than what most outlets have reported, make sure you're subscribed to the Obscure Report. I post every update as it happens, and what comes next in this investigation is going to matter. The first thing that distinguished this ransom operation from a conventional kidnapping for ransom case was the delivery mechanism. Whoever sent the notes didn't contact Savannah directly. They didn't reach out to Annie Guthrie, Savannah's sister, who has been deeply involved in the search. They contacted TMZ and Cole D News, a Tucson-based local television station. Let that land for a moment. The person or people allegedly holding a 73-year-old woman sent their demands to entertainment media and a local TV news outlet. That choice is not random. That choice tells investigators something specific about the psychology and the strategy of whoever was behind it. Ransomers who contact media instead of family are typically doing one of two things. They're either creating leverage, making the story so public that the family is pressured by outside attention to pay faster than they otherwise would, or they're creating noise, broadcasting the demand to so many parties that it becomes harder to track which communications are genuine and which are opportunistic. In this case, investigators reportedly concluded it was the second. The media strategy wasn't about pressure, it was about cover, and the choice of TMZ specifically is worth sitting with. TMZ is not a random media outlet. It is the single publication in American journalism with the most documented track record of receiving tips directly from law enforcement personnel, hospital staff, and individuals connected to criminal cases, and publishing that information before anyone else. There is an entire ecosystem of sources that feed TMZ information about celebrities and public figures precisely because TMZ pays for information and publishes fast. When a ransomer routes their demand through TMZ rather than through a law firm or directly to the family, they're making a specific calculation: that TMZ will publish the demand before law enforcement can suppress it, that the public pressure generated by publication will force the family's hand faster than a private negotiation, and that TMZ's publication history with sensitive information gives the note a kind of credibility. A signal that the sender knew how to make something real in the public eye, not just in a direct message that Savannah Guthrie could delete and never mention. It's a media-literate criminal move, and that media literacy tells investigators something about who they're looking for. The same logic applies to Cold News. Cold is the local Tucson station most closely associated with crime coverage in the area where Nancy disappeared. Sending a demand to the local outlet most likely to recognize the case details and immediately treat the note as credible is not an accident. It's a targeting decision. Whoever sent these notes understood the local media landscape of Tucson. That knowledge, local, specific, Tucson-calibrated, is itself an investigative data point. The notes themselves demanded what was reported to be millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The specific figure that emerged in reporting was $6 million. And the notes contained details. Specific details about what Nancy was wearing at the time of her disappearance. Details that someone would have had to have direct knowledge of the scene to include. That specificity is significant, and it cuts two ways. On one hand, it suggested to investigators that whoever sent the notes had real access to information about Nancy. On the other hand, it did not establish that Nancy was alive. It established that someone knew something about what happened. Those are not the same thing. Here is the distinction the FBI made, and it is the distinction that everything else in this investigation turns on. A proof of life is not a proof of knowledge. Knowing what color jacket Nancy was wearing when she disappeared proves you were there, or you know someone who was. It does not prove she is currently breathing, conscious, and waiting for the ransom to be paid before she is released. The notes reportedly contained no current proof of life, no code word Nancy could only provide herself, no dated statement, no audio or video recording that placed her in a specific living context at a specific time after the disappearance. According to investigators and sources familiar with the FBI's assessment, this was the first red flag, and it was a significant one. To understand why the FBI's position was what it was, you need to understand why Bitcoin became the currency of choice for modern criminal ransom operations in the first place. And the answer is not just that it's digital. It's that it was designed at its architectural level to be resistant to the specific mechanisms that law enforcement has historically used to freeze and recover ransom payments. Before Bitcoin, the most common ransom payment mechanisms were cash and wire transfers. Cash has obvious problems for a ransomer. It's physical, it has weight and volume, it requires a pickup location that can be surveilled, and large bills have serial numbers that can be tracked. Wire transfers are fast and global, but they pass through financial institutions that are regulated, monitored, and legally required to report suspicious transactions. A wire transfer of $6 million to an account that didn't exist a week ago triggers automated compliance systems at every bank in the chain. It gets flagged, it gets reviewed, it gets frozen. And if the FBI has the receiving account identified, the money can be stopped before it ever arrives. Bitcoin was designed to solve a different problem: peer-to-peer financial transactions without a central authority. But in solving that problem, it also created a mechanism that ransomers latched onto precisely because it lacks the central intermediary that law enforcement can compel to freeze or reverse a transaction. Because here's the brutal logic of ransom negotiations that most people don't fully understand. Bitcoin payments are irreversible. Unlike a wire transfer that can sometimes be recalled in the early hours, unlike cash where serial numbers provide at least a theoretical trail, once Bitcoin moves to a designated wallet and the sender confirms the transaction, it is gone. There is no chargeback. There is no recall. There is no mechanism for the FBI to reach into a blockchain and pull $6 million back out after the fact. The payment would be permanent, and the FBI was being asked to recommend that Savannah Guthrie authorize a permanent, irreversible payment of $6 million to someone who, as of the deadline set in the notes, had not proven that Nancy Guthrie was alive. The first deadline, according to reporting, was February 5th. It passed without payment. The second deadline was February 9th. It also passed. And the FBI's position, communicated to the family, was consistent throughout: do not pay. The reasons behind that position are what this video is about. And there were three of them. Three specific, documented analytical conclusions that the FBI reportedly reached, each of which, independently, would have been sufficient to advise against payment. Together, they built a case for a strategy that prioritized identifying who did this over the alternative of transferring $6 million and hoping the person on the other end of the transaction was actually holding Nancy. The first reason is the one we started with, the proof of life vacuum. The notes knew things, but knowledge of a victim is not the same as custody of a victim. The FBI had reportedly identified a specific inconsistency between what the notes claimed and what the biometric and investigative data suggested about Nancy's condition from the time of her disappearance. The pacemaker signal, if the reporting on this is accurate, was not a dramatic flourish. It was a piece of real-time health monitoring data. Modern pacemakers do not just regulate heartbeats. Many of them transmit continuous RF signals to bedside monitoring stations, which then upload data to clinical servers. Some connect directly to cellular networks. A remote monitoring system logs cardiac activity and transmits it at intervals that can be tracked. If Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker had been transmitting a signal continuously, and that signal went silent at a specific time, that timestamp would be in a clinical database. And if the timestamp of that signal going silent preceded the arrival of the first ransom note by 48 hours, or any significant interval, then investigators were looking at a possible scenario in which the person demanding $6 million was demanding it for the return of someone who was no longer alive to return. That possibility, according to sources, shaped every decision the FBI made from the earliest days of this investigation. I want to be clear about what this means and what it doesn't mean. Pacemaker signals going offline can happen for many reasons that do not involve a medical crisis, device malfunction, interference, range from the monitoring unit. It is not a death certificate. Investigators reportedly did not treat it as certainty. But in the specific context of a kidnapping case where no proof of life had been provided, where blood evidence had been found at the scene, and where the ransom demands were being routed through entertainment media rather than direct family contact, the signal going dark was one more data point pointing in a direction the FBI could not ignore. They were potentially negotiating with a ghost, and paying $6 million to a ghost doesn't bring anyone home. The second reason the FBI advised against payment is the one that most criminal justice analysts point to as the most tactically significant: forensic tracking and what investigators refer to as dusting. Let me explain what this means in the context of a cryptocurrency ransom operation. When someone sends a ransom demand and the target does not pay, the ransomer is forced to make a choice. They can disappear, cut contact, abandon the operation, and move on. Or they can continue communicating, issue a new deadline, adjust their demands, send more notes, try different media contacts. Every time they communicate, they generate evidence. Every communication is a potential fingerprint. Ransom notes sent via digital channels, email, direct message, media tip submissions, leave metadata. They can reveal IP addresses if the sender made an error. They reveal behavioral patterns: what time of day the messages were sent, what platform was used, how the language and tone shifted over time under the pressure of deadlines passing without compliance. They can reveal chain-hopping attempts, the crypto technique of moving funds between wallets to obscure their origin. If the FBI is monitoring the wallet addresses named in the notes, and they create a behavioral timeline, the longer the operation continues, the more data points accumulate. The FBI reportedly made a deliberate strategic decision. Not paying was not a refusal to engage. Not paying was an active investigative tool designed to keep the source of these demands communicating long enough to be identified. What the FBI built to counter this is one of the most sophisticated financial intelligence operations in the history of law enforcement. The Bureau works closely with blockchain analytics firms, companies like Chainalysis and Elliptic, which have developed proprietary tools for mapping the transaction graph of every major cryptocurrency network. These firms maintain databases that cross-reference wallet addresses with known criminal activity, known exchange accounts, and known cash-out points, the specific places where cryptocurrency eventually has to touch the traditional financial system to become spendable by a human being in the real world. Because that's the dirty secret of cryptocurrency crime. At some point, the Bitcoin has to become dollars. And the conversion from Bitcoin to dollars almost always requires an exchange, and exchanges are increasingly regulated, require identity verification, and report suspicious transactions to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The moment a ransomer tries to convert their Bitcoin to spendable currency, they enter a system that is watching. There is a documented parallel case that provides context for this strategy. In 2021, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack resulted in a payment of approximately $4.5 million in Bitcoin to the DarkSide criminal group. Within weeks, the Department of Justice announced it had recovered approximately $2.3 million of that payment by seizing the private keys to a specific wallet. The mechanism that made that recovery possible was exactly the kind of blockchain forensics the FBI had been building for years, tracking the movement of funds through wallets, identifying the points where cryptocurrency is converted to fiat currency, and following the trail of chain hops until it terminates somewhere that investigators can reach. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the FBI's cybercrime unit was reportedly monitoring the Bitcoin wallets named in the ransom notes from the moment those addresses were disclosed. No funds moved into those wallets, which means either the kidnapper was waiting for payment before providing a destination, or the addresses were placeholders in a plan that was already falling apart under investigative scrutiny. And if you want to follow every layer of this as it develops, because there is more coming, and the blockchain data alone is a story within a story, subscribe. The Obscure Report. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this case. The third reason the FBI reportedly advised against payment is the one that most people have underestimated: the hoax pandemic. In the days immediately following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the combination of her daughter's public profile, the national media coverage, and the public disclosure that Bitcoin ransom demands had been made created a specific kind of secondary threat. Opportunists. People who had no connection to whatever happened to Nancy, who had no information about her whereabouts, but who saw in the existing media narrative an opportunity to insert themselves as the kidnapper and attempt to collect ransom money from a family in crisis. 4 days after Nancy disappeared, a man in California was arrested. He had been communicating, reportedly posing as the kidnapper, making claims about having Nancy, using the publicly known details of the case to make his account seem plausible. He was not the kidnapper. He was someone who had been following the news coverage, absorbed enough detail to sound credible at first glance, and attempted to exploit the situation. The FBI had identified him relatively quickly, but his arrest immediately created a problem that should not be underestimated. It meant that investigators were now operating in an environment where multiple people were claiming to have Nancy, where distinguishing the genuine actor from the imitators required the FBI to have information that had not been made public. A filter test that only someone with real access to Nancy could pass. This is why the FBI instructed the family to keep specific information private. Not because they were being secretive for its own sake, because the information that wasn't in the public record was the only mechanism investigators had for sorting genuine communications from the flood of opportunistic noise. Every detail disclosed in a press conference, every piece of information published in a news story, was simultaneously a piece of information that the next person trying to impersonate the kidnapper could use to make their fake claim sound real. The silence was operational. The silence was investigative. And the silence made the ransom notes themselves a forensic tool, because whoever sent those original notes demonstrated knowledge of details that the family had not released publicly. And that specificity of knowledge, even as it failed to prove current custody, at least allowed investigators to separate the genuine source from the imitators. This brings us to a dimension of this investigation that has received almost no attention in the broader coverage: the specific involvement of FBI Director Kash Patel. In what was a highly unusual move for a sitting FBI director, Patel reportedly used his public platform on X, formerly Twitter, to post images of a suspect captured by a Google Nest security camera. The significance of that detail, Google Nest specifically, is something investigators and technology analysts have pointed to as a demonstration of a specific forensic capability that the public doesn't fully understand. Google Nest cameras, when connected to a user's Google account, store footage to cloud servers continuously. When the physical device is disconnected, destroyed, or stolen, the cloud footage does not disappear. The last frames captured before the device went offline exist on Google's servers and are accessible through valid law enforcement requests. What this means in practical terms is that whoever tampered with or removed the camera at or near the scene of Nancy's disappearance may not have eliminated the footage they intended to eliminate. The cloud had already received it. This is a pattern that investigators in high-profile cases have begun to account for systematically. The assumption that destroying a recording device destroys the recording is outdated. It hasn't been true for years. Every device connected to a cloud service, a doorbell camera, a smart home hub, a personal phone that backs up automatically, generates a forensic record that exists independently of the physical hardware. The footage Patel posted was reportedly extracted from exactly this kind of cloud archive, and the fact that it showed a suspect's image is one piece of data. The more significant piece of data is what it demonstrates about investigative capability, that the person or people behind this operation may have believed they had eliminated certain evidence and may have been wrong about that. Let me take you into the blockchain side of this in more depth, because it's where the technical picture of what the FBI was tracking becomes most specific. Bitcoin operates on a public ledger called the blockchain. Every transaction, every time Bitcoin moves from one wallet to another, is recorded permanently and publicly. The addresses are pseudonymous, not anonymous. They're strings of characters that don't immediately identify a person, but they do identify a wallet. And once you identify a wallet, you can trace every transaction that has ever gone in or out of it, going back to the very beginning. The FBI's cybercrime unit and the network of blockchain analytics firms that work closely with federal law enforcement have developed sophisticated tools for mapping what the industry calls the transaction graph, the web of wallets that funds pass through as they move from a source to an eventual cash-out point. Chain hopping is the technique ransomers use to try to defeat this tracking. You receive Bitcoin in wallet A. You immediately move it to wallet B, then to wallet C. You convert a portion to a different cryptocurrency, Monero perhaps, which has stronger privacy features than Bitcoin, then convert it back. You use decentralized exchanges, peer-to-peer trades, mixing services that combine funds from multiple sources to obscure which coins came from where. Every one of these hops adds complexity, but every hop also creates a record the blockchain doesn't forget, and the FBI, with time and the right analytical tools, can follow a chain of hops across dozens of wallets if they have enough of the transaction graph mapped. The wallets named in the Nancy Guthrie ransom notes received no deposits. The deadlines passed. The Bitcoin didn't move. But the FBI had those wallet addresses from the moment the notes arrived at TMZ and Coweld, and according to investigators familiar with the case, those addresses were being monitored continuously. Not just the wallets themselves, but any wallets those addresses had previously interacted with, any transactions in the history of those addresses that might link them to a known exchange account, a previously flagged criminal network, or a prior case. The absence of a payment didn't end the blockchain investigation. In some ways, it created cleaner conditions for it. There was no incoming transaction to account for, no sudden movement of funds that would require investigators to rush their analysis. The wallet sat idle under surveillance, and whatever could be extracted from their prior transaction history became the subject of forensic analysis. Here's what the publicly available blockchain data showed in the time since the ransom notes arrived. The specific wallet addresses that were disclosed in reporting were examined. What investigators reportedly found, and what blockchain analysts with access to the public ledger have independently identified, is a pattern consistent with wallets created specifically for this operation, with minimal prior transaction history, suggesting they were set up recently rather than being part of a longer-standing cryptocurrency operation. That's a specific behavioral profile. It suggests someone who understood enough about Bitcoin to set up wallets and demand payment, but who may not have the deeper technical sophistication of an experienced ransomware group or international financial criminal. It's the profile of someone who learned enough to seem credible, not someone who has done this many times before. Now let's talk about what this tells us about the three most credible theories for who sent these notes and what their relationship to Nancy's actual disappearance is. The first theory is that the ransom notes were sent by whoever is directly responsible for Nancy's disappearance. that this is a genuine kidnapping for ransom operation, that Nancy was taken with the specific intent of demanding payment, and that the person or people behind it misjudged how the FBI would respond. Under this theory, the choice to send demands through TMZ and KOLD instead of directly to Savannah was a calculated decision about leverage and media pressure, not a sign of amateur improvisation. The choice to demand Bitcoin rather than cash was an attempt to stay ahead of law enforcement's traditional money tracking capabilities. The failure to provide proof of life was either a deliberate negotiation tactic, maintaining uncertainty to prevent the family from giving up, or a sign that the proof of life couldn't be provided because of circumstances the kidnapper needed to conceal. This theory has the most investigative weight behind it because the specificity of the details in the notes, details about Nancy that required scene-level knowledge, points to a direct connection to the event itself. The second theory is more disturbing in a different way. That Nancy was not taken with ransom in mind, that whatever happened to her was not initially a financial crime, and that someone with knowledge of what happened attempted to exploit the disappearance by constructing a ransom scenario after the fact. Under this theory, the person sending the notes was not holding Nancy. They were someone who knew something about what happened to her, who may have been present, may have been an accessory, may have gotten information from someone who was, and who saw in the media storm around Savannah Guthrie an opportunity to extract money from a family desperate enough to pay. The absence of genuine proof of life under this theory is not a negotiation tactic. It's an impossibility. You cannot provide proof of life of someone you don't have. And the routing of the demands through media, rather than direct family contact, begins to look less like a leverage strategy and more like a way to maintain distance, to create enough noise and chaos that by the time investigators zeroed in on the source of the notes, the person behind them could claim they were just a hoaxer rather than someone with genuine criminal knowledge. The third theory is the one that the California arrest makes most relevant, and it's the one the FBI spent significant resources specifically trying to rule out in the early weeks. That the ransom notes were entirely opportunistic from the start, that the specific details they contained were assembled from a combination of publicly available information and educated guessing, and that the person or people behind them had no connection whatsoever to Nancy's disappearance. This theory would make the notes not evidence of a kidnapping, but evidence of a separate crime, attempted extortion, fraud, layered on top of a missing person case. The FBI's filter strategy, keeping specific information private so that genuine actors could be distinguished from imitators, was designed precisely to test this third theory. Someone operating under Theory 3, constructing their ransom claim from publicly available information, would eventually run out of accurate details. The real actor, if one existed, would have access to information that couldn't be guessed. There is something else about the FBI's response in this case that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, and it connects directly to a pattern investigators have documented across multiple recent high-profile missing person cases involving public figures. When a missing person has a famous family member, the case attracts a specific category of individual that investigators have begun tracking as a formal threat category, the informed opportunist. These are people who are not connected to the crime, who do not have access to the victim, but who have absorbed enough publicly reported detail to construct a plausible-sounding false claim. They're different from pure hoaxers because they're not randomly inserting themselves into a case they know nothing about. They're specifically targeting cases where enough information is publicly available to make their false claim credible to a layperson, even if it falls apart under investigative scrutiny. The California man who was arrested was reportedly in this category. He used specific details that had been reported publicly, details about Nancy, about the case, about the ransom demand, to construct a communication that, on its surface, sounded like it could be coming from someone who was actually involved. The FBI identified him partly because he could not pass the filter test. When investigators pushed back with specific questions about information that had deliberately been kept out of public reporting, his answers revealed that he was working from the same publicly available information as anyone else reading the news. He didn't know the things that only someone with real access to Nancy would know. And that filter, the deliberate maintenance of a private information reserve, is one of the most important tools the FBI uses in exactly this kind of case. The Pima County dimension of this investigation adds another layer that has not been fully examined in public reporting. Court filings in Pima County, the jurisdiction where Nancy disappeared, reportedly document tensions between the sheriff's office, led by Sheriff Chris Nanos, and the FBI over the handling of the early investigation. In cases involving potential kidnapping of a family member of a high-profile public figure, jurisdiction and evidence handling become immediate operational concerns. The FBI has protocols for exactly this scenario. The concern is not about bureaucratic turf. It's about the integrity of the forensic record. Evidence collected improperly in the first hours of a crime scene examination can become a problem at trial. Evidence that establishes a chain of custody correctly from the first moment the scene is secured becomes the foundation of a prosecution that holds. The reported friction between county and federal law enforcement in those early hours is not a minor administrative footnote. It's a detail that matters if this case ever goes to trial, because the defense in any subsequent prosecution will examine every piece of the early evidence collection process for procedural vulnerabilities. Let me be specific about what FBI takeover of a kidnapping investigation actually looks like, because the procedural reality is more significant than it sounds in press releases. When the FBI formally assumes operational control of a kidnapping case from local law enforcement, it's not just a jurisdictional handoff. It's a complete restructuring of the investigative architecture. The FBI deploys what's called a crisis negotiation unit, trained negotiators whose specific expertise is extended communication with hostage takers and ransomers. These are not investigators who occasionally talk to criminals. These are people who have studied thousands of hours of ransom and hostage communication, who understand the psychological patterns of different categories of actors, who know the difference between a demand that is designed to be met and a demand that is designed to create time. They work alongside the FBI's cyber division, which handles the blockchain and digital forensics components, and the Violent Crimes Against Children unit, which has jurisdiction protocols for cases involving elderly victims in addition to children. What this multi-unit deployment means in practical terms is that the FBI was running parallel tracks in this investigation from a very early stage. One track was the negotiation strategy, managing communications, running filter tests, maintaining the information reserve. A second track was the digital forensics track, the blockchain monitoring, the metadata analysis of the ransom communications, the cloud-based footage extraction. A third track was the ground-level investigation in Pima County, the physical scene, the evidence, the witnesses. The FBI's position on payment was not generated by one analyst making one judgment call. It was the output of multiple teams evaluating multiple data streams simultaneously and reaching a convergent conclusion. And that convergent conclusion was, the cost of paying outweighs the benefit, given what the data currently shows about the probability that payment produces the outcome the family wants. What the FBI reportedly concluded was that they needed to take operational control not just of the ransom negotiation, which was always going to be a federal matter given the interstate and potentially international dimensions of a Bitcoin demand, but of the broader investigative strategy. That included the decision about payment. And that decision, as we've established, was informed by three converging factors: no proof of life, the forensic value of keeping the line of communication open, and the need to filter genuine actors from the wave of opportunistic hoaxers who had already begun emerging within days of the disappearance. The border angle is one more element that investigators reportedly factored into their assessment. Sasabe, Arizona sits on the U.S.-Mexico border approximately 60 miles south of Tucson. It's a small port of entry in a remote area of the Sonoran Desert. In previous cases involving criminal actors operating in the region, Sasabe has come up as a potential crossing point for individuals attempting to move funds or people across the border with reduced scrutiny. The concern investigators reportedly had was specific. If a Bitcoin payment of $6 million was authorized and the funds were received, the liquidity that created, the ability to access cash across multiple countries, to fund movement across a border in either direction, would make the investigation significantly harder. Not impossible, but harder. Every hour between a Bitcoin payment clearing and an investigator tracking the first chain hop is an hour in which someone with $6 million worth of cryptocurrency can convert, move, and obscure. The strategic calculus of the FBI was, we preserve more investigative options by not paying than by paying. The worst outcome of not paying is that we can't close this case quickly. The worst outcome of paying is that we fund the permanent disappearance of whoever is responsible, and we still can't close the case. The investigation, as of the most recent public reporting, remains active. Brian Hooker has not... I'm sorry, that's a different case. Let me be precise. No arrests have been made in connection with the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The California man who was arrested for impersonating the kidnapper was a separate charge, fraud and attempted extortion, not a charge related to Nancy's disappearance itself. The ransom deadlines of February 5th and February 9th passed without any Bitcoin movement to the named wallets. Savannah Guthrie has maintained a public presence while her mother remains missing. The investigation is ongoing, coordinated between the FBI and Pima County authorities. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. What the FBI needs to close this case, what would allow them to move from investigation to prosecution, is a connection between the person or people who sent the ransom notes and the physical events that took place at Nancy Guthrie's home in Tucson. The blockchain record tells them something about the financial architecture of the operation. The Google Nest footage gives them a visual. The metadata analysis of the digital communications gives them behavioral patterns. The pacemaker data, if it is what sources suggest it is, gives them a timeline. But a prosecution requires more than a collection of digital breadcrumbs pointing in a general direction. It requires a specific person, a specific act, and a chain of evidence connecting the two that holds up under cross-examination by a competent defense attorney. That chain is what investigators are building. And every passing week without an arrest is not a sign that the investigation is stalling. It's a sign that investigators are prioritizing a prosecution that will hold over an arrest that might not. The Derek Colea dimension of this case is one more thread that has gotten some attention but deserves more careful treatment. In the weeks following Nancy's disappearance, a man named Derek Colea was arrested in connection with what authorities described as a fraud scheme, a case that intersected with the media coverage of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, but was reportedly not directly related to the disappearance itself. Colea's arrest added to the noise around this case, creating confusion in media reporting about who exactly had been arrested and for what. That confusion is not accidental. In a case generating this volume of media attention, the signal-to-noise ratio is a deliberate investigative challenge. The more noise, the more arrests, the more claims, the more media stories about tangential figures, the harder it becomes for the genuine threads of the investigation to be identified by anyone watching from the outside, which may be, at least in part, by design. What this case has already become, regardless of how it ultimately resolves, is the first major public test of what investigators are already calling kidnapping 2.0. The deliberate routing of ransom demands through media, the use of cryptocurrency rather than cash, the exploitation of a victim's family member's public profile as a pressure mechanism, the creation of a hoax ecosystem within days where imitators attempt to cash in on the authentic crime. Every one of those elements is going to be studied and will shape how law enforcement responds to the next case that follows this pattern. And there will be a next case. The playbook, such as it is, has now been run publicly enough that anyone paying attention has seen what works and what doesn't. The FBI's response, the refusal to pay, the forensic patience, the filter strategy, is also now public. The next iteration of this crime will account for what happened here. There is one more element of this case that I think deserves to be stated plainly, because it tends to get lost in the technical analysis of blockchain forensics and FBI negotiation protocols. Nancy Guthrie is someone's mother. She is a woman who spent her life investing in her family, who raised a daughter who went on to become one of the most visible journalists in the country, and who had, by every account of people who knew her, a faith and a warmth that were the defining features of how she moved through the world. The technical complexity of this investigation, the cryptocurrency wallets and the pacemaker signals and the metadata analysis, can sometimes create a cognitive distance from the human being at the center of it. I don't want that to happen in this coverage. Every piece of investigative detail we go through is ultimately about one thing: finding out what happened to Nancy Guthrie and making sure that whoever is responsible for whatever happened is held accountable for it. Savannah Guthrie has continued to show up to work throughout this ordeal, She has maintained her public presence. She has, by all available evidence, trusted the process the FBI outlined while living inside a reality that no amount of professional composure can fully conceal. That tension, between public composure and private devastation, is something that only the people closest to her can fully understand. But it's present in every public appearance she's made since her mother went missing, and it's worth naming. What I keep returning to in all the time I've spent with this case is the human cost of what happens when a crime is constructed around a specific person's grief and another person's public identity. Savannah Guthrie is a journalist. She knows what investigations look like. She has reported on tragedies and crimes for years. And then it became her family, her mother, the woman who raised her. And the FBI's message in those first days was, "We understand you want to pay. We understand the instinct. But paying is not the right move. Trust the process." And the process is grinding forward, slowly, the way investigations always do. Not with the speed of a news cycle, but with the methodical accumulation of evidence that eventually produces a result that holds. Here is what I want to ask you, and I want you to answer in the comments because I read everyone. Given everything we've covered, the proof of life vacuum, the blockchain forensics, the hoax pandemic, the pacemaker signal, the border crossing concern, do you believe the FBI made the right call in advising the family not to pay? And if you were in Savannah Guthrie's position, with that FBI guidance in one ear and your missing mother in the other, what would you have done? Because that's not an abstract question. That's the question at the center of this case. Every theory about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, every investigative strategy the FBI deployed, runs through that single decision point: to pay or not to pay. And the FBI said not to pay. I want to know what you think about that. Subscribe to the Obscure Report. This investigation is active. I am watching every development, every court filing, every public statement from law enforcement, and every piece of blockchain data that surfaces in the public record. There are stories inside this case that haven't been told yet, and I'm not going to stop until they are. Next time, we're looking at a case where the digital evidence said one thing, the physical evidence said another, and the person who got it right was the one everyone assumed was wrong.